get a nice playing garden, which is great. So there's lots of people who can do this outside areas now. And just for those who are doing the last day, just a bit of disclaimer, the questions that we've got prepared for tonight, there will be some spoilers. So just wait till we have a look at it, but I'm really hoping that we can get into how to talk about all these references. And there's a time difference too, isn't there? Is it about 9:30 for you?
Yeah, just on 9 o'clock, so not too bad.
Put it there. A bit better? Is that better?
Yep.
So yeah, and you're coming to us, thanks so much for giving us your time.
Oh, my pleasure. No, the time difference works out well, actually. They're all asleep, so yeah, no. It's such a pleasure to be here.
So, Hannah, you didn't always want to write, did you? I read somewhere you actually
It's true. It's true that I wanted to be a bricklayer, but it's the reason I wanted to become a bricklayer is actually because from quite a very young age, I have no recollection of this, I told my parents that I wanted to be a writer. I think they told me I was 6 or something, and their response was one of support and encouragement, but at the same time, as I grew up and I still wanted to be a writer, they would encourage me to always, be interested in something else, maybe have another vocation. So being a bricklayer was there's something else for a couple of years, but it has been many things. But actually, the writing's been pretty constant since I was quite little.
Yeah, so you were you the type of child who would write lots of short stories and things, or did you associate it with drawings and things like that?
Oh yeah, I wrote a lot of very bad poetry, and I mean, I probably wouldn't have any memory of it, but there's so much video evidence of me very solemnly standing in front of the camera, reciting very dramatic poems about earthquakes and things like that. For the drama, had a taste for tragedy early on, I think. But no, yeah, it's always been something that I've loved to do, very much so.
What about your children? How old are your children?
My eldest is 4, she's just turned 4, and I also have a 2-year-old.
So 4-year-old, do you find that she has a love of language?
She does actually, yeah. It's she's always loved books. I mean, we've read to both of them from very young ages, and they love storytelling. And neither of them, obviously read or write themselves, but I think I can already see they have that feel for narrative. If you set up a story, they can finish it for you, which is such a beautiful thing to see. So it's lovely to see it. Yeah, it's lovely to see it play out in the next gen.
Yeah, exactly. We think bookshops do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, they love bookshops. Love libraries, love bookshops.
Do you know, my nieces and nephews think that I'm just the absolute queen because I own a bookshop. It's fabulous.
That's amazing. Yeah. It's a magical position to It's a magical thing to do.
Yeah. So, which authors would you say were most influential in the group and in your lifetime?
Oh, when I was a kid, I read everything all the time, and just the classics. I mean, my parents were great, but they didn't try to, I guess, curate anything that I read. So I read all sorts of stuff. I loved The Babysitter's Club. Read a lot of, Enid Blyton and all the sort of classic, 80s, 90s childhood stuff. But then when I when I was in high school and I started thinking seriously about writing, I assumed that I had to read serious books. So that led me to become quite a fan of the Russians at this really kind of cringy, a cringy early age. But then I think I kind of hit my strides, in my late teens, early 20s, when I really fell in love with writers like Virginia Woolf, who just made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, and Margaret Atwood, Angela Carter. I discovered, more poetry that was just, just kind of blew my little writerly mind apart. So that was when I really started finding, I guess, some of the writers who I still read, of course, but I feel that I owe them a great deal and really sort of lighting a fire underneath me. So definitely people like Emma Donoghue, Angela Carter, Margaret Atwood, they were my mainstays, and particularly in my early 20s.
Because your writing is incredibly lyrical, it's so poetic. Does it take a long time to write? Because each sentence is so complete itself.
It's a funny thing, right? It's hard. Sometimes so much of writing, I really don't like to mysticize the writing process because so much of it, as we know, is just turning up and getting the work done. But sometimes you do have moments where the writing arrives and it's a matter of just kind of following it through and you're in a zone. I have sections of writing I don't recall writing because you're just kind of in a space. And sometimes it's a grind. You have days at the desk where you spend hours just fiddling with sentences. I read a lot of my work out loud and I'm sick of the sound of my own voice by the end of the day and I still haven't got it, so it's a bit of both. But sometimes it arrives and it's organic and it feels exciting and fresh and new, like a gift. And sometimes you're very much aware of, the craft behind it and the difficulty inherent in that.
Yeah. So, do you find that reading others' work to be a part of your personal professional development when you're writing something yourself, when you're in the writing? Do you find that to be advantageous, or do you kind of hold off from experiencing others' work when you're working on something yourself?
It's such a good question, and I'm always so interested to hear what writers have to say in response to this because I think everyone has a slightly different take. I know many other writers, some of my other writer friends will not read when they're writing because they're concerned about kind of adopting a different voice or kind of adulterating their own style or just becoming kind of distracted or, too self-conscious about the fact that they're reading something polished and they're writing a draft, which is necessarily messy. For me, I rely really hard on reading other writers when I write. It's, in the last couple of years, for instance, when I've had those difficult days of grind where it's not really working and it feels very difficult and you kind of feel like you're stuck in a rut, I will turn to people like, Sebastian Barry or Max Porter who have that beautiful lyrical style. How beautiful are their books? And those works, something like Money, I just think it's just an extraordinary book.
So glad you said that.
Oh, good.
I was up, I reread that so many times, and then gifted it to so many people, whether they like it or not. It's so special, that book.
It is so special, and I think because it has such a strong sense of self. For me, when I read it, I don't then go back to my computer screen and think, oh God, how can I aspire to something like that? It's very much like, I think what it does, reading books like that and reading certain writers, is that it reinvigorates a sense of play with writing. It makes me excited to write again because it's, I don't know, I feel like whenever I get stuck in my writing, I have to remind myself that I was always a reader first, and I have to get back into that reader space, because that's what always then brings me back into writing, being an excited reader and wanting to create something like that. So yeah, very much. Yeah, that's kind of my take on it. I think it would be very hard for me to write something in isolation from other language.
Yes.
I see it, as very much an intrinsic part of, I guess, the creative process, in many ways.
Yeah. So, and I do apologise, I do have to put down occasionally.
Oh, go for it.
So, in an interview with the Sydney Morning Herald, you referred to a teenage affirmation that you wrote for yourself: writing feels like breathing. After the international success of the 3 books, shifting to writing for the screen, does writing still feel like breathing? Is it intrinsic to who you are, or has it become a little bit more challenging as your career has progressed?
That's a good question. It's a really good question. Yeah, undoubtedly, it still feels like breathing to me. Today, I had all this sort of work and sort of stuff I needed to get done, and there was something that I needed to write, and I was reluctant to do it because, procrastination, all that sort of stuff. And I sat down and I started doing it, and as soon as I sort of eased into the draft, that was the feeling I get. It feels like relief. It feels like, I don't know, it just feels like a good way to be. It feels like breathing. It still does for me. And I think the challenge is sometimes, there is, a greater challenge sometimes in trying to maybe shut off a part of my mind, which is now, say, for instance, aware of the fact that something I write will probably, have more readers than what I anticipated for my first novel, which was, my mum and a thesis examiner. and to kind of shut out the white noise and to stop sort of anticipating a finished book, but just to kind of be present within the joy of writing. And if I can get to that place, then I really kind of forget about all that sort of stuff. I'm not really thinking about, my publisher, sorry if they're listening. I'm not really thinking about that. I'm not thinking about, really any reader beyond just the experience of writing it and that attempt to try and convey, to convey the meaning or the feeling or to try to articulate what it is I'm hoping to do. It's very much like a mindfulness exercise in some ways. And that process of being present within the creative act does, always feel like breathing. But sometimes the other stuff does creep in because you start thinking, sometimes I think, no one's going to want to read this book. Is it too weird? Is it, people are going to expect something else and I'm writing something completely different. And when those stories come, when those feelings or those fears come creeping in, then that's, to me, the time to read. It's the time to step away from it all and return to that place of just joy, just trying to find the play in it all.
Yeah. Just before we go on, just here's a word in mind, and I can't stop looking at Hannah. So maybe start, hey, you really something to get my attention. You also would like to ask a question, because I'll just keep you down. So, Burial Rights and Good People are both historical fiction centred on historical crimes. What inspired you now to write a love story?
Good question. I think devotion in many ways was, kind of a conscious step away from what I'd done previously. Burial, I never set out to become a writer of historical fiction per se. I was interested in literary fiction, and then I kind of was just completely haunted by a story, by a story I'd encountered, during my time of being an exchange student in the north of Iceland. And I could not get Agnes Magnusdóttir out of my mind. I had so many questions about her life. And that then led me to start writing about her, considering her story and the ways in which she might have been misrepresented throughout my time at university doing creative writing, to the point where I was writing essentially an early draft of Burial Rights for my not yet completed PhD thesis. So the reason why I guess I then continued to go on and do historical fiction was, one, I encountered the true story that The Good People is based on when I was researching Burial Rights. And two, although I hadn't necessarily set out to become a historical novelist, I found that process in researching Burial Rights to be so much more than what I anticipated. I think setting out, I thought, research, you have a bunch of questions, you find out the answers, you get on with the book. What I discovered instead was that so much of the research process is inspirational. You find new ideas, you end up with more questions than you have answers. And that can be an incredible way to form character, or just throw up things you read will throw up new questions. So much of it comes back to, who we still are as humans and things that we still experience, the universal things that are there all along, the problems that don't go away. So it felt very natural for me to then continue looking at historical fiction. And with both of those two early books too, I was kind of wedded to the research process. I was writing about real people who have existed, writing about the dead. I felt like I had to be respectful. And a way to do that was to kind of apply this rigorous kind of research methodology. When I came to write Devotion, I knew quite early on that I wanted to step away from what I'd been doing earlier. I didn't necessarily want to, paint myself into a corner as the writer who picks a maligned criminal woman from the historical past and tries to subvert that history. Because it started to feel a little bit comfortable, and that can be a good thing. But for me, I thought, no, I want to challenge myself. And I was also ready, I felt, to perhaps write about Australia. And also, along this sort of thought of, I'd love to write the Australian landscape. It's something which I have such a great love and respect for. How can I work that into a novel? I was thinking, do I want to write about Australia's colonial past? not really, because whenever you're inhabiting a historical novel and historical characters, you're kind of appropriating their prejudices, their worldviews from the time. I was thinking, you know, is this something I want to do? Do I want to write about Australia's historical past from the perspective of a coloniser? Because I'm not going to appropriate an Indigenous or First Nations perspective. That's not my space to take up, or my voice to, like I said, appropriate. So along these sorts of early thoughts of what I thought I might wanted to do, we had the same-sex plebiscite. And that year, 2017. And at this stage I was thinking, okay, I want to move away from criminal women. I'd love to write about something which is a little bit more celebratory, not necessarily superficially light, but something which is a little bit more uplifting. And I want to write about Australia, and I sort of had these sort of disparate thoughts. And then when we had the plebiscite, I was sort of bracing myself for it. I was with my girlfriend, my now wife. I was pregnant with our first child. We'd just sort of trying to create a family, and suddenly our letterbox is filled with these vitriolic pamphlets trying to deny basic human rights. And I kind of had a crisis of faith in writing. I was thinking, you know what can I do? What can I felt powerless, I guess. And I had a moment where I sort of had to give myself a talking to and remind myself of the power of storytelling and the fact that you can create change and change minds and support other people through representation. And it was at that point that I thought I could do something quite scary, because it felt scary to me, and turn this historical novel that I'm kind of dancing around into a love story between two women. And that was the point where, in Charlotte Wood's words, that Jesus in The Luminous Solution, that was heat-seeking. That was when I realised I had something alive, something worth pursuing. But it was absolutely contemporary events which led me to kind of really push the difference, I guess, between it. I was already thinking, I want to do something a bit different. I want to move away from what I've done before. But the love story came from my anger at getting a bunch of homophobia in my letterbox.
Absolutely. And when you mentioned power, that's so evident in the book as well. That actually, tell me how to pronounce the main character's name. Is it Hannah and Tia?
Hannah and Tia. Yeah. Oh, you can anglicise it, whatever.
Hannah and Tia. So the power. Sorry, my phone is moving around. These women are experiencing incredibly powerless situations. In fact, so many people in 1800s Russia were in incredibly powerless positions and situations. So that theme is also running through this book, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, totally. I mean, it's as much as I feel like devotion was a move away from what I'd done previously, the same concerns always circle back in, I think. I mean, I think it felt important for me to tell a story that centred queer love and queer joy, especially at a time when this was part of a national dialogue. And, I also read this amazing memoir by Michelle Duchanovsky called The Ghost Wife. She's an Australian writer. Yeah, which was kind of about a similar theme. And she had this beautiful quote in it which talked about essentially the queer community's inheritance of silence, of a silent history, because so many stories we don't receive because they've been either actively suppressed or never told, there was never space for them. And I feel that in all my books, I am drawn to that which isn't present. It's an attraction to absent, which isn't said, all those silences, the gaps between what, I guess, those received narratives that we get, the other side of the story. And that was another thing that I thought, when I read that quote, I was like, this is the time then to, in this received history of silence, to articulate something in place of real stories. Why not invent them that can speak to that?
Yeah, how do you feel about the finished product now that it's out there and the reception? You've got a fabulous reception for this book?
It's been, it's been incredible. I mean, in many ways I was a little bit nervous about it because it was different. It's also probably the most personal of all my books. There's a lot of sort of, obviously, as a queer writer, there's that, but more so just there's lots of bits of my family kind of woven in secretly in the book to the point where they will be able to pick it out. It's about my home country. All of these sorts of things meant that I had a kind of a different kind of fears or excitements on its release, but the response has been overwhelming, actually. It's been incredible. I've had lots and lots of people get in touch with me. and to tell me their responses to the book and their different takes on it, and it's actually been just so incredibly rewarding. I'm still pinching myself about it, actually.
Yeah. So, because I've seen one of your interviews and you talked actually about that you had, there was a lot of research that went into this book as well, because it is also non-fiction, but that you did fill a lot of the gaps with your own story, your own story. Was that an easy?
Yeah.
Was that an easy process to do? Was that?
I think it's probably, yeah. And look, I think it's always nerve-wracking when you feel like you're writing a little bit close to the bone, because it's an act of vulnerability, right? Especially when you're sharing something with people that you don't know, and potentially anticipating judgment. The love story in the book isn't based on my own relationship or my own family, but those characters are invented and they are wholly themselves. But I think my wife's name is Heidi, I think, and the book is dedicated to her, and I've made no secret that the book actually, is a love letter to her. And the reason I say that is because, one, it would never have been written without her. She stopped working to look after our tiny children so I could write it. What a sacrifice. And also, too, in the end, when I was, concerned about writing something so, different for me and had those sort of normal human, apprehension, it was the decision to just write something that she would enjoy. That, I guess, guided me throughout it. And in the end, that's what I was doing. I thought, look, if all at the end of this, I've just come up with a novel that both she and I are going to love, with characters that we already love because we talk about them, then that's enough. It was, again, different process. It was less objective. It felt like much more of a subjective experience, but a rewarding one for that.
Yeah, so because, I suppose your other two books, they are, because in this book, you actually have, don't you have, I read something there, family connection or historical connection to the Lutheran community in Hahndorf?
Not Hahndorf, more the Barossa, but they all intermarried, so basically.
So your other two books, there is that degree of separation, but this book, touches so close to the bone.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well done, it's beautiful. Okay, so actors sometimes have difficulty letting go. It's big to lose this. Actors sometimes have difficulty letting go of their characters after filming has wrapped. What about writers? Do your characters stay with you after you've finished them?
Yeah, they do. They do, very much so. Not in the sense that perhaps like an actor where I've inhabited them, so I feel like they're part of me. It's more, I have a different relationship, I think, to all of my characters. Agnes Magnusdottir, I spent so long just reading about her and considering her and then grieving for her through both learning about her life and then writing it, and sort of interpreting it in my way. That was like, so much of that book felt like an act of grief. And I remember when I finished the first draft, just bursting into tears. A moment which should have been one of elation to me. First draft of a manuscript done. A pretty huge step for any early career writer. I just remember I just put it down and I just wept. And so I still think of her all the time. I have photographs of the place where her bones are now lying, the churchyard of Thun, hanging up in my office, and I feel, I have a strange connection, I think, to her, but not so much her as she is in my book, but the historical characters I read and learned about her. And the same goes to a certain extent for the women at the heart of the good people. Hannah and Taya being my first completely fictionalised characters, they're not based on any real life figures. It's a different relationship, but they've come to embody so much of what is special for me, and is in many ways act as a parallels for other relationships in my life and things that are meaningful to me. They are the embodiment of so much which is meaningful. But I think of them. I remember I actually think they mean more to my wife. I remember when the book was finally, off to the publisher, we sort of had a toastie and a tiny little piccolo of champagne. And she said, I feel really sad. I feel really sad now that these characters are going out into the world and other people are going to read them when we've had them for so long. So maybe she feels it more than me.
That's actually interesting because last year we hosted Craig's Albany. And in that interview, he actually talked around these sorts of things. He mentioned that once his finished book is published, he no longer feels ownership of that story. It belongs to whoever reads it, and it's theirs to interpret. So I'm interested to know how you feel about that statement. Like, do you have a sense that you are these stories, or your life is a little bit emotional about these two beautiful characters going off, and they'll be read and interpreted in so many different ways. And
yeah, it's so interesting that Craig said that. I completely agree. I think for me that is actually part of the joy of when a book goes out, is because I just think that a book is only ever half written by its author. You can only do so much because, and this is my perspective as a reader more than anything, because I know that when I pick up a book, I'm bringing it to a lifetime of subjective experience and my own prejudice and opinions and ways of thinking, all my own influences. But also I'm reading it with an open mind, and I might make connections that the author never did. And that to me is the magic of reading, right? Is that you are given this you're given a book, but suddenly it's a world inside your mind. And that to me is also a gift for a writer, is because you trust the reader to complete it in the way that is, best suited to them or appropriate to them. And you know that it will be interpreted differently, but that's part of the joy of it. So yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I actually don't never read my books once they're published for that reason, because it doesn't really feel like it's mine anymore. It's just out there. And then when you do finally have those amazing experiences of hearing from readers, and people always pick on something slightly different each time that maybe spoke to them, or they will tell you stories from their life because it prompted it. And I mean, that's incredible. That's the magic of it.
John Downs is a local author. He residing in Albany here, started as an
Oh, great.
And he, in a discussion over his book once, he has said that that's one of the good readership, to be able to identify and hold in your mind the author's intention, but to also create that room and space for your own interpretation, and to kind of put that to reader who does that much too,
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is one of the reasons. Sometimes I'm asked, so all of my books, not quite devotion, but most of them have been, optioned for various things, and there are people who are going to interpret them, whether that be film or other people have other ideas. And I'm often asked, how do you feel about someone adapting your book? Will they ruin it? And in my mind, it's just, they're creating something new. It's not yours anymore. You've told your part of the story, and if people want to build on that, then it's, the passing of the baton.
Because that's happening right now, isn't it? Like Jennifer Lawrence, her company,
oh, don't ask me, I actually don't know. Better brush up on that before I meet her.
Her studio that she has bought the rights to terrible rights, and she's going to play Agnes May's daughter. Is that right?
Yes, that's the plan. So hopefully, fingers crossed that it all comes to fruition. But I mean, that's exactly it. And I mean, Burial Rights is a great example, because that wasn't a story I even made up. That's something which has been interpreted many times. Maybe mine was one of the first in English, but I mean, in Iceland, there's been multiple interpretations of those historical events. There's been a film made about them. So there's going to be another film. So again, I don't see it as something which is sacrosanct and as inherently belonging to the writer. It's very much that it's an offering that you're putting out there, and then people build on it and make it something new again, which I think is a beautiful part of it.
And I can't wait until these things come out so you get to view them, because it must be amazing to see these cinematic choices and the cinematography that's going to express aspects of the book, and maybe music and things that are going to associate two things in your book and heighten things. Like that'll be wonderful, I imagine.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I mean, burial rights, I don't have any part of it, but The Good People, my second, I'm actually writing the screenplay for. So to a certain extent, yeah. So to a certain extent, I'm kind of already making some of those decisions. Yeah, it's interesting. It's like having the option to write the book all over again. But yeah, absolutely, I can't wait. I mean, film is, a film has so much input from so many different talents, so many different visions. It's what makes it so special. It's never going to be a book, it's something else entirely. So I think if you can appreciate it for the creature it has to be, then nothing is lost.
It sounds like you are really comfortable with that, and that you can let go of any kind of creative control on these sorts of things, let it become its own thing. And I thought that because I'm possibly a bit too much of a control freak, actually. But that's my thing.
Oh, look, it's understandable. I get it why some writers don't like it either, because you spend such a long time working on something and you have clear intentions, perhaps, and if they're not interpreted correctly, then that could be disappointing. But I see it from a different perspective. I mean, the book's not being burned in lieu of the film. The book's going to still be there, so yeah.
So, as I mentioned earlier, you've done some screenwriting and you're doing the screenplay for Good People. But you wrote an original screenplay for Run Rabbit Run. Was that an easy transition to go from writing novels, particularly historical novels, then to writing what I'm assuming is fairly completely fictionalised screenplay?
Yeah, it is. It was a massive learning curve, but I mean, it was a fantastic opportunity. It came about, I felt like in so many ways the opportunity was handed to me. I was very lucky to be approached by Carver Productions, which is a Victorian-based production company. They made films like Snowtown, amongst others. And Sarah, some more light material. Sarah Shaw and English. They came up to me and they said, look, we think maybe your writing has a visual quality. Have you ever considered writing for screen? I was actually super keen on writing for theatre at university. That's what I wanted to be, more than a novelist. And I sort of thought, I'd be really interested. And we had a meeting and I pitched them 5 very bad in retrospect ideas, and they were very polite and very sweetly were like, well, let us know if there's anything else that you think of, we can always speak. And I was like, okay, that was a fizzer. And then as we were finishing our coffees, they started asking about future novel projects, and at the time I was interested in writing about children who have experienced previous lives, or say that they have, and talk about other families and so on. And I was interested in exploring that from the perspective of a parent. And their ears kind of pricked up and they sort of said, oh, well, would this be something that you would be interested in pursuing as a film? And it all kind of started from there. We received funding from Screen Australia through their Gender Matters initiative, and then became the very scary process of, when I write books, I don't show the early drafts to anyone, not until it's, 10 drafts down the line. And here it is, draft 1, they're like, okay, we need to see it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. I find my way into a project through writing it. So I mean, totally different in the collaborative nature of it, and the back and forth and the very early criticism and feedback. But I think it's made me a stronger writer for it. Because I mean, a screenplay, it's 100 pages, and the devotion was 120,000 words, if not more. So it's an exercise in concision, and it was interesting trying to write something where you don't have the interior space of characters, rely very much on symbolism. But I mean, what an opportunity to give someone who's never written a screenplay before the opportunity to do so. I owe so much to them.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to jump into some questions about the book Devotion now. So in the book, we experience music and singing as elements of connection and identity for the characters. Hannah experiences the natural world through both music and song. And we see singing as a strong binding form of togetherness for the local community. I'm curious about this. I'm curious what part music and song have in your life. Did you come from a music background at all? Are these elements a reflection of you, or perhaps these are results of your research into Russia and hundreds of women communities?
It's a good question. I think it's a bit of both. I come from a musical background. My mother was a piano teacher for years. I was actually a percussionist. I played the drums for most of my teen years, but also Irish folk instruments. I have an eclectic series of hobbies. So I played a lot of music and did lots of performing and stuff when I was a kid. But I don't think that's where, the presence of music came from in the book. I think it probably came from the other thing you mentioned, the research. So much of what I read about these congregations who left Prussia during this time to emigrate to Australia and escape persecution, they spoke of the many times that they sang throughout the day. We still have first-hand accounts of them waiting to leave on the ship, singing every dawn, at every dusk, and people coming to listen because they sang beautifully. And so I knew from a very early, from quite early on, that singing and music were an integral part of worship for them. So it felt like a natural fit for music to kind of permeate through the book. But I was also interested when I was thinking about the character of Hannah, who narrates the story. I was interested in the idea of difference, that this is someone who, especially in the early parts when she's a young girl, perceives herself as different from her family, different from her peers, and in many ways not quite able to fill the roles that have been allocated for her. And I think I was considering the idea of music as worship, music as part of faith. And I was really struck by the idea that Hannah is someone who revels in music as part of that, within the church, within the services, but also hears nature singing to her. And that too provides communion with God. So, spirituality for her was not confined to church services, to the doctrine that her family follow. It's ever present, it's everywhere she goes. So she experiences divinity in a much more broad, malleable, nature-based, possibly pantheistic sense. So this was sort of some very early sort of thoughts I had about her character. They arrived quite organically. It just seemed to make sense to me when I was thinking about her. And then the more I wrote the manuscript and the early drafts of material, it just made sense. Just music and song just kept coming through. It was one of those things I mentioned earlier, the organic stuff which arrives and you just kind of recognize it for the gift it is. The presence of music and its role in the book was very much part of that. I didn't have to fight to find ways to include it. It was there from the start because of Hannah, and then it continued throughout and, started incorporating the plot and all those other elements. So music and landscape were massive, I guess, informed so much of how I saw her character.
Yeah. Do you consider Hannah to have synesthesia? Is that something that you were leaning into as well?
It's so funny because since the book's come out, I myself have referred to it as synesthesia. And I don't really know why I do that, because when I was writing the book, I didn't ever stop to think, it's a condition, it's synesthesia. I think probably it could be, but when I was writing it, the definition was much more open. To me, it was much more this sense that this is someone who, it's about engaging with nature on a level that is different to everyone else.
She felt like a resistance where she...
This is totally, a sense of someone finding belonging in nature because it's singing to them, it's nurturing them, it's an exchange in a way that the other music, as employed by the congregation, it isn't an exchange in that it's a form of worship, it's an offering. Whereas the music that Hannah experiences nature is more about being reminded that she's a part of everything. There's less of a hierarchy.
It's interesting that Hannah, there's that wonderful passage where Hans is reflecting upon Hannah and talking, he recounts that time when she was able to divine water by hearing it, by being connected to nature and laying in that spot. She was convinced that all was low. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I think that just kind of came about again. I just always thought of Hannah as someone who was very much connected with the natural world, because she hears it and so she's interested and invested in it, but that she has kind of a sixth sense and a different perception of it. I mean, throughout the book, she observes that so many, her family included, the congregation, as they travel to Australia and form their little Germanic settlement in Paramount country, that their regard towards nature is one of sort of opposition. or it's at the most benign, it's one of guardianship and of stewardship. Whereas she sees herself as not separated at all from nature. She's very much part of it. And then you see that, become a literal truth later on in the book. So, it was just something which, in my early writing, where I write a lot of stuff that I think, oh, this might not be in the novel. It's just me trying to work out character. A lot of scenes that way, and it just kept coming up. So, I thought I would just have to include it. And also, I've met people like that who have that kind of relationship to nature. My uncle, when in his youth, could always divine water like that, and he has that kind of sixth sense. So it was a nod for him.
Like an independency or sort of the natural world or something?
I think it's just another level of connection. I think in many ways we can become quite dislocated from nature and see ourselves as separate from nature. And I don't really agree that that's the truth. I think we are absolutely a part of it. We are natural creatures, we are part of it. We're not, who are we to sort of lord dominion over it, or to bend it to our will, or to even see ourselves as other from it, I think so much of this book was in some ways a consideration, me working out my own thoughts about this sort of stuff. But I think it's, we are very much all intertwined. It's all, we don't have that distance.
Yeah, which is what very much expresses. So, it's interesting to talk about nature and the natural world being kind of in opposition to the communities and, how they were living on and off the land. Because concepts of spirituality, and they are a spiritual congregation, concepts of spirituality and the natural world seem to be quite intrinsically linked in this book. Many parts of the book feels like spirituality is explored through the lenses of nature as opposed to in the churches of the congregation. What made you focus more on the natural world and pulling us into the typical ways of worship?
Sure. I think predominantly because it's narrated by Hannah. So any interpretation of it is always, this world is just filtered through her eyes and her approach to life. And I knew quite early on that I would have a first-person narrator. I wanted to kind of find someone's voice and stay in it for this book. And I think that's why. You could very easily tell this story in myriad of, other ways. And you could this could have very easily been a novel which went into the sort of minutiae of worship and of religious difference and that world of a congregation and a community engaged in faith together. But as soon as I found Hannah's voice, which was quite soon after I started writing, I knew that wasn't going to be the way this book was going to go. It was going to, go down stranger rivers because of the difference inherent in my character, which I'd already sort of felt quite, as I said, really early on.
Yeah, and it's really early on from the first page.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting you mentioned the first page because for ages when I was trying to find Hannah's voice, I couldn't get it right. I wanted kind of a lyricism. I wanted this kind of connection to the natural world. And one day I just went for a walk and then I came back and I was like, oh, Hannah, just write something. And I sat down and I wrote a paragraph and I thought, okay, I'll put this in my notebook. It probably won't be in the novel, but it'll be a touchstone because there's the voice that I want. And in the end, it's the first paragraph of the book. If you ever go back and read it, that's one of the first things I ever wrote for the novel and it still was there. And that was when I knew that, it was going to go these other ways, that it was going to be nature-centric, even as it explored religion. It was all about, nature as divine and our relationship to it as divine.
Yes. Because even when, and this is a spoiler for the live stream, but even when Hannah's death occurs, her relationship doesn't kind of end or diminish as one might expect with death, but in fact it gets stronger. She's kind of an observer of everything going on, but she's utilising the natural world to get closer to her observations of those that she loves and she tried to
Yeah, you have this moment where that physical connection that she had to nature is completely gone from her, but the spiritual connection remains, I think, which is why there's so much set up in the first book about the way that she connects to nature. That's that spirituality, that aspect of it remains even after death. And then it is probably because of the intensity of that spiritual connection to the natural world that eventually she regains some of that physical connection too, in terms of the ways in which she's able to briefly, and again, massive spoiler, to become part of the natural world, kind of inhabit it.
So I am interested by that though, and I hope you don't mind digging into that deeper, but yeah, because she still has an impact upon. So it's interesting, like when she was living and we're seeing her observations of her day-to-day life and the lifestyle she lived, and you see very much that the life and death is a part of their life in the congregation. They all communally get together and slaughter animals and everything's used, and so it's quite normal, it's there. But there's a real kind of giving and receiving sort of aspect, and then when she has died, she still has an impact upon life and death, because we see her be able to merge with the natural world, and that's the way that she's able to have that re-feeling of living again. But it's at the cost of killing that which she's inhabited, or if not completely killing, she's kind of, it's to the detriment of that aspect. So, what made you choose to express Hannah's experience with life and death in that way once she was in the afterlife?
Such a good question. Sometimes I think of things that I want to write without quite knowing why. And one of the things that I knew I wanted to write with this book was Hannah becoming a pig, inhabiting a pig. And I remember I had two other writers I meet up with, as sort of a writers group, and I was like, would you read a book where a young Prussian woman basically took possession of a pig? Would that be something that you would read? And they're both like, where are you going with this? Like, you know where I'm going with this. But I have this and I can't shake it, and I keep wanting to write it, and I wrote it quite early, this scene. And then it's kind of like having a vision of something in the future, and then when I got to that point in the book, I was like, oh yeah, no, I see why now I was interested. All this stuff was kind of seeded throughout. But I was, the reason why, I felt it's kind of like any speculative fiction. You have to put parameters on your world that you're building. And the powers that a character can have. And I did start to think, if Hannah, in her own words, it remains tethered to the world, basically through love, through her devotion. This is the force that is keeping her so close to those that she loves. And the intensity of that, of her feeling and her already existing spiritual connection with landscape means that slowly she can kind of attain a kind of physicality. There needs to be a limit to that. Otherwise, who's her to stop inhabiting, someone for good, and then essentially living out the life as a possessed person, as a zombie. So I was like, quite early on, I had to think, okay, there needs to be a limit to it. And also, the fact remains that she is dead, and that she carries death within her, and perhaps I was thinking about the ways that it would affect. I think there's always going to be a consequence for any action. So that's why that came about. But the pig was something that really early on, I don't know why, but for some reason I want to write this scene where a woman becomes a pig. It's a bit bonkers, but I just you sometimes you have to follow your weird gut intuitions, and then by the time like I said, I got to that point, I was like, this is where it fits in, this is what happens, it makes sense. And from a plot perspective, I could see it, how it was already playing out.
And then it was such a act of devotion, wasn't it, in itself? Devotion to and respect of life, devotion to the animal that was then, the consequence of the animal, and then to Taya herself, because that was a motivation, wasn't it? Because Taya was so, she's a huge empath, and she was really affected by the death of animals. For meat and things. It was beautiful. Yes.
Oh, thank you. I came across lots of anecdotes in my research of young women, lying about being on their period to get out of the slaughter day, or just being really distressed by it. I think sometimes when we have these received notions of people in the past, we think, oh, they were all hardened and stoic and they just got on with it, and that's not always the truth. So it was a nod to that too.
Yeah. Themes of faith feature in all of your books. From what I've read, faith also seems to feature in Run, Run, Run. Would you agree?
Yeah, in a different sense, perhaps.
Yeah.
I think I'm interested in faith not so much because of religious institutions, although they are interesting. I think it's much more. Excuse me. I'm interested in faith as a vessel which holds people's fears and desires and insecurities. I'm less interested in the gods, more interested in the people praying and the reasons why. And I think that's probably why it keeps coming up. But also from a research perspective, Margaret Atwood, I think, has mentioned like the three figures of authority which loomed large in the recent historical past, and that's always the judge, the priest, and the doctor.
Yes.
And they pop up all the time. I mean, they held such influence and sway. It's in many ways, when religion was such a part of the structure or administration of so many people's lives from the past. So many of the censuses that we have were taken by people, who held religious office. People were taught school, that people were schooled by people who held religious office. It's kind of hard to avoid. I always wonder at historical novels that don't mention religion because it was such a big part of people's lives. But yeah, in terms of the reasons why, certainly in this book, I've spent longer looking at these kinds of congregations. Yeah, it's the same reason why I'm interested in the supernatural, and I think that's in all the books. It's not about the ghosts, it's about the people frightened of them.
Yes, yes. How is everybody feeling? Yeah.
Really enjoying listening.
And how are you going, Hannah? Right to
Yeah, it's good. I've got my cup of tea, I've got some caffeine up here.
So, Hannah doesn't experience any kind of afterlife as opposed by the Lutheran teachings of her upbringing. You see, there's a lot of history. As much as she's connected to the natural world, she does vision of the periphery, and as you had said, she is definitely a woman of devotion and divinity, but not necessarily in the ways that everyone else in the community is. So when she comes into the afterlife, so you see lots of discussion of religion and devotion and divinity in the first part of the book, and when she's in the afterlife, none of that's there, none of what's expected or what she's been taught is there. So what made you choose this contrasting outcome for the character? It's a fabulous one, I loved it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I think, the reason to even have her die in the first place was very much influenced by my own decision as a writer to write a queer love story like I was talking about earlier, but one that managed to avoid shame as an integral part of the plot or narrative.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, there are many, many wonderful historical novels. I mean, Sarah Waters, incredible, but that feature queer love or same-sex relationships. But it's very hard to find one where shame doesn't play a part of it.
Yes.
It's very often the people either deny their own feelings, so there's an act of self-oppression, or self-hatred sometimes. It's not reciprocated, so it's, there's yearning and pining, and it's still quite negative and sad. Or there's discovery and repercussion, or there's being outcast, there's ostracism. And I think I wanted to avoid all of those things.
Right.
I knew I wanted also to be able to create a relationship where both characters were completely clear-eyed about the way that they felt for one another, even though people growing up within this community probably wouldn't have really had much of a vocabulary to speak to it, would not, could be experiencing these emotions and not recognising them for what we would in a contemporary world. So I knew those were the things that I told myself. I said, if I'm going to write a love story, I don't want to write a narrative of shame. And early on, I started to try and write some scenes between my two characters, which I'd already developed, Hannah and Taya. And I had them do things like marry, because that would have been expected for them, and they're both trying to be happy for each other. And everything I wrote, one, just seemed so bloody miserable, and two, just was kind of dead on the page. And I thought, no, I'm not going to be able to do this. I mean, you know that you need a narrative arc as a writer. There's going to have to be consequences. There's something's going to have to happen if they fall in love with each other. And it's either they're going to be together and all this other awful stuff's going to happen because historical context, or they're not going to ever get together or be aware of it, and it'll be one of lost opportunity and grief. And that was when I thought, but if I can dislocate my main character from that historical context, if I can kind of take her outside of time, her own time, get her to possess a pig, have some world experiences, realise that everything's not as she's been taught, then that's one way of kind of breaking that down completely. And being able to have a narrator who's like, I'm completely in love with this person, this is a love story, this is the nature of our love, and then to act on it in ways which are also perhaps not necessarily expected. It's nothing like having conversations with your editor about a ghostly threesome, you know, things that I do in my career. But so, you know, it just, when I thought upon that idea, I thought, it was just that moment where I was like, yeah, I think she has to die halfway through the book. I think that's absolutely something that happens. And that just changed the tenor of everything else that I've been working on. It also solved, it's not that it's a problem, but it enabled me also to remove Hannah from the prejudices that she would have, you know, held, like her congregation and family did regarding, you know, colonisation, the stuff that I was talking about earlier. You know, it allows her to see that even though the relationships between the Prussians and Paramount are friendly is not the best word, but not outright, there's no outright violence, and certainly there wasn't in the first couple of years. You know, it's an act of theft, which is still a hostile and violent act. Yeah. So it allowed me to write about those sorts of things. And so like I said, it allowed me to write a queer love story that was able to concentrate on that joy and to elevate it, I guess, outside of the otherwise necessary kind of punishment and self-denial and all of that stuff.
And this is great,
yeah.
So the relationship between Matthias and Hannah is a really beautiful one. They've got a really deep, profound bond, and that's from the first page as well. You see, maybe the first or second page, he's there. He's just so wonderfully part of Hannah's life. She's very connected to him. What made you choose for Hannah to be a twin?
I don't know. I wish I could remember. You know, I had this great experience. Burial rights was studied in many high schools, and I have some wonderful students still contact me and ask me questions and also make associations that I ask them, can I take that? Because I had no idea. And you've made a wonderful association. Can I pretend that I knew what I was doing? They sort of like, oh, you know, the idea that you didn't intend this or you happened unawares. I mean, it's wonderful. There's no, you talk about fine leadership. I've seen some amazing leadership from high school students. But in terms of the twin and Matthias, I mean, he's one of my favourite characters. And I think early on, I knew I wanted to have some strong male characters that, again, subverted the tropes that we often receive, particularly about this kind of, you know, using quotation marks, the pioneering sort, these stoic, silent men who are not tender, but who are hardworking. You know, we have in the Adelaide Hills and in this Paramount country where I live, we have these received kind of narratives about these families and about these men and the stories that continue on about them and the ways in which they're memorialised. And I kind of wanted to just, I don't know, nudge that aside a little bit. I was really interested in exploring tender men in this book. And I really love the idea of Hannah, who sees herself as being so alone, actually not ever really being as alone as she feels that she is.
Yeah, that's so true. It's such a juxtaposition, isn't it? Because there's lots of her expressing exactly that, how alone she feels, but then she's also constantly celebrating this deep connection she has with her brother. Yeah, she's never really
And I love the idea. I think a twin too, because I mean, they shared a womb and yet there are such different expectations upon them. So it was a way to explore too the dynamics within the socialisation of young people in that community. But also another point of connection for Hannah once she had died to her family, in having a twin who was able to live on and grow up in a way that she wasn't able to. And then in the process of, writing devotion, my sister had twins, so I'm sure she thinks it's bad. But no, coincidence.
So there are strong maternal characters and themes in this book. Once in the afterlife, we see Hannah experience a deeper understanding and appreciation of her own mother. There's these beautiful scenes where she's actually understanding, acknowledging, for maybe the first time, and understanding her mother's grief of losing children. And it's that beautiful passage, I think, when they're on a ship and I think they're just coming into Australia, and Hannah's ghost is kind of saying, my mother has parts of herself back in Russia and in the ocean, like it's beautifully written. So, she also knows how her mother conveyed love. There's beautiful moments where she sees that, this strength that her mother had to have to let her children uproot them on this massive journey, But once she's in the afterlife, she's able to observe her mother so differently and sees between the lines of it all. There's also actually, along with my mother, one of the most beautiful parts. There's this exquisite passage when Taylor herself gives birth, and Hannah immediately identifies with the Lord as part of her and her own. That was so beautiful to read, and I understand that when you were writing this book, Devotion, that's when you became a mother. Both of your children were born during Brad. So, in what ways did becoming a mother influence or impact your writing of the themes of motherhood in this story? Do you feel like there was a connection there for yourself?
I think there has to be. I think an interesting part of becoming a mother and a parent that I hadn't necessarily anticipated was a slight shift in my relationship to my own mother.
Yes.
When you're not sleeping and you're dealing with it all, you haven't. I felt. This is, I'm sure, not true for everyone, but I know I felt I had a renewed appreciation for all that my mother had done for me as an infant. Just the drudgery sometimes of it all, and the difficulties. I don't subscribe to the idea that you need to be a parent to write about parenthood. Not at all. It's like people know what it's like to have kids without having kids themselves. You care about the same stuff. I don't think it's like suddenly an awakening in that sense. So I would argue that it didn't necessarily change any way that I portrayed motherhood, but I think it changed the way I portrayed daughters. So I think that's probably that stuff there about a shifting relationship to a mother, a lack of complete understanding, or an inability to sort of see your mother as a woman, really, outside of her relationship to you as an individual who has had a past, who has taken on, all sorts of, who's taken on the roles that are expected of her, but has also swallowed down a lot of grief. I was interested in writing about this kind of dynamic because I think it can be true of adolescents in their relationship to their mothers. It can often be, people are at different, you want different things, and this is true as well with Hannah and her mother. And then once she's passed away, she can see her mother perhaps for the first time in her life as a woman and not just as a mother. And that's something that I think maybe, possibly, as I'm realising it now talking to you, could have been fed by my new consideration of being a daughter and the new way of seeing my mother, rather than me now being a parent, if that makes sense, or anything to do with my own children.
Yeah. So the love story between Hannah and Taylor is profound, moving. It's beautiful that the tenderness of their blossoming love is juxtaposed by their own naive teenage struggles with identity and self. What made you choose for Hannah and Taylor to be so young?
I don't know. That's a really good question. Again, I should probably sit back and reflect once I've finished a book and have answers to these sorts of things. So much stuff just arrives, it happens that way. I think with Hannah and Taya, with Hannah particularly, you know, I mentioned this being a personal book. I had very strong feelings of feeling different to my peers when I was around her age, you know, 14 and 15, and the isolation that can give you, but then the power too of when you do find someone who seems to recognise you in totality and accept you completely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a powerful gift at any point in our lives, but I think when you are young and you feel everything so deeply, you know, I remember, you know, talking about Hannah in the natural world. I remember walking home from school once, and it was so beautiful. I was in front of this lake, and this light was glancing off it. It was just a particular angle I happened to catch it at, and it was so exquisite. Like, I burst into tears. These are sort of the heightened emotional life of a 15-year-old.
Yes.
And I felt that Hannah is someone who does feel things deeply, so it felt very natural to explore those experiences. I was also really interested in looking at the ways in which Hannah, at this point in her life, she's, you know, had quite a lot of freedom. When she was a child, you know, she didn't have these womanly expectations. Her life wasn't domestic, and now she's at that point of transition where her life, she's suddenly been confined indoors. And for someone who has that kind of relationship and ability to commune with nature, I mean, how hard that must be.
Yeah.
And so she's struggling against everything which is expected of her and feeling that she can't fulfill these expectations and struggling knowing that she's disappointing everyone, and then she meets someone who she isn't disappointing to at all.
Yeah.
And also sees in that person is able to offer that same kind of recognition and that same kind of acceptance. And it was a beautiful thing to kind of reflect on a friendship initially, then also blossoming into to love as they age. And that was something that I was really interested in doing, rather than having, you know, two characters who perhaps hadn't had any formative experiences and suddenly met each other and fell in love. It seemed much more natural in my mind to have a deeper love come from something, a trust and a connection which had already been formed.
Yeah. What was the impetus for, actually, I think I may have already talked about this. We may have covered this, but I hadn't really, what was the impetus behind Hannah's death? What motivated the creative choice for her to die and experience colonialism and settlement from the objective perspective of those? But I think we probably covered that one.
Yeah, it's like, just to reiterate, it was basically the only thing I could think of that would allow me to write the kind of love story I wanted to from the perspective, and also to write about the you know, colonialism, you know, in a negative light, basically. I'm sure there are other writers who would come up with other solutions, but, you know, it's probably also worth saying that, you know, we said I had my 2 children. I was very tired. Every parent, you know, it's the most common complaint in the world. But I was really tired, and I think I wrote some of this book in a fever dream, and I swear I made that decision after a night of like 20 minutes sleep. So maybe that's playing a slight role. Maybe that's how motherhood evolved. All the craze, probably the pig scene came about after the so maybe that's how it you know, made a contribution.
Your lack of sleep, like, she'll get heaps of rest.
Yeah. She'll just, you know, nice, yeah, it's just ideation, basically.
What were the challenges of writing about the colonial experience in South Australia? You know, with, like, talking about, I think we're just pronounced as
Paramount. Yeah.
Was it challenging to write because the Paramount people and countries discussed a lot in the book? So did you link into some good resources? Did you have guidance for that to be able to tell that narrative?
I did. It was something that I was obviously very mindful in terms of getting it right. I spent a lot of time researching and trying to find, you know, everything from journal entries to letters which described the relationship, particularly the one at Harndorf, which highly endorsed the village the book is based on, between the Prussians at Harndorf and the Paramount people who, the area of the name is Buckatilla, the same as in the book. That was a seasonal place for them, where they used to do a lot of kangaroo hunting and also use the river system there as well. I was trying to find these sources, and I was reading them, and I was noticing that a lot of them corroborated the same sorts of I guess, facts, if we can even call them that. The same sort of stories, a lot of them alluded to the fact that there was sort of a wary friendship that existed between the two groups. But I was also mindful as I was reading these resources that they were all written by the Prussians, you know, so it was really important for me to be able to speak with someone who could offer a perspective, you know, which was Indigenous. And I had the great fortune of meeting and speaking with Elder Mandy Brown, who's a local Paramount elder. And I mean, we chatted about all sorts of stuff. She read, obviously, some of the work that I'd also drafted, but we also spoke a lot about the supernatural elements in the book and about spirituality. And thanks to our conversations and her generosity, I was able to revise what I had already written in regards to Hannah's relationship and the way in which she is perceived by the Paramount people in the book. So that was a massive part of it. But I mean, it's probably one of the harder aspects of it. And there were many times where I was concerned that I was not doing the right thing. And by right, I say the respectful thing, or I was concerned about holding up fictionalizations as truth. I was concerned that there wasn't adequate representation. And I think these are really necessary problems to have, because we need to consider about this sort of stuff when we're talking about writing about and fictionalising Australia's colonial past and our ongoing colonial present. But yeah, absolutely speaking to Mandy, it was a huge part of it, and I feel so indebted to her. But yeah, a tricky thing when you're trying to do your research and be rigorous, and the research is, you know, completely white. So I did. I tried to do I tried to do the best I could with what I had, which unfortunately was never enough. Is what I was hoping for.
Does anybody have a question? Yes. I knew you wouldn't have. I think my nan's here. She's another.
Great.
Which was your favourite part of your research and why? And which was the hardest part of your research and why?
I was, thank you. The favourite part of the research and the hardest part? My favourite part was discovering the journals of Dirk Hahn, who was a captain of the Zebra who brought 200 Prussian immigrants over to Port Misery, as Port Adelaide was colloquially known back then. The reason why I loved it was because so much of these journals, as I was reading them, were incredibly dry. When at this stage of the book, I didn't know if I was going to really spend much time on board the boat, because I had never experienced it. It seemed like a difficult thing to write about it without a lot of knowledge. And then I found these journals, and I thought, well, the captain's going to write down observations of a journey like this. And he did. He didn't really include very much detail. It was often sort of, these immigrants do a lot of singing and they hold religious services, that they're a very polite bunch and very clean, yada, yada, yada. But then I got to the end of his journals, towards the end, and he retracts everything he says. And he says, I might have not been as honest as I ought to have been. And then he basically lists just all these grievances, all these conflicts, these fights, physical fights, accusations that have been levelled between the passengers. The reason being, he thought that some of them might go to court and he would be called upon to testify, so he wanted to get the details down. And I mean, what a gift as a novelist to finally get the human face after this kind of hagiographic kind of mention of this place. Immigrants, suddenly you've got people like bickering over bacon rations and, getting argumentative with the sailors because they're looking at their women funny, but some of the women want to dance, and like it's a mess. And it was so fantastic. That was my favourite discovery, because suddenly this, it influenced so much of the book. I was finally able to write about that journey because there was suddenly so much detail. And all the events which occur on the ship journey in Devotion are drawn directly from his account. So, the scene where the hatches are being battened down and people are worried that they're going to suffocate, that was something that happened. Someone falling down the stairs and having a miscarriage, that happened. But an incompetent doctor who tried to introduce a live smallpox vaccination on the ship and then also adulterated his own medicines with ground up glass. That's true, that happened. So I mean, that was my favourite thing to find. In terms of the hardest thing, I would say it was probably looking at those, it was all anecdotal, all the anecdotal evidence relating to the relationships between the Paramount and the Prussians, because the bias and the prejudices are there, and you're trying to kind of glean what is accurate and kind of cut it away from these colonial attitudes, and that was really tricky. And also, you've only got so much to work with as well, and I wish I had a lot more. So that was probably the most difficult part, but really aided in the end by being able to speak to someone as knowledgeable and as generous and understanding as Mandy Brown.
Thank you.
I really liked the paragraph when Hannah came back to the settlement and you said, all this way they have disfigured the land back into Prussia. And I thought that was another very beautiful, poignant part of Hannah's journey she was putting herself apart a little bit from her community. She still saw them come all that way. And I'm an immigrant myself. I know that clinging to something from the old country. So they couldn't quite assimilate into the country. They had to recreate what they had had.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this is something that absolutely happened. There are accounts of other German-speaking travellers coming to Australia and kind of being tourists at that time. And there's a wonderful account of a man who was doing this and encountered these sort of German villages, and just like, oh my gosh, where am I? He writes about us being completely disoriented. He thought he was in Australia, and now he's back in Prussia, down to the details on the furniture and the old woman, rocking a crying baby by the fire. He was just completely discombobulated by the experience. So yeah, that was something I felt I ought to include. But you can see it still. I mean, there are many places in the Adelaide Hills which were original German towns, and they're still in the formation. And it's interesting, but at the same time, I feel like there can be a sense of loss there, because the descriptions of Buckatilla before Harndorf was built there, I just seem exquisite. It's described as an open parkland filled with kangaroo grass. I've never seen anything like that in my life. I would have loved to have seen it before that, anything was built there. Yeah. So, that's probably where that came from.
Matt and I were talking about this afternoon. South Australia, there wasn't much convict settlement, was there, in South Australia? So, was that, did that make it a bit easier to not have to, being based in South Australia with this emphasis whether it was campaigns and that you have to worry about conflict, challenges, convict challenges on top of everything else?
Yeah, it's funny. I think South Australians, everyone says we sound a bit British. People, I think, like to say it's because we don't have a convict past, and of course that's completely not true. It's true that it was never intended for, a convict settlement, that it was intended for free settlers from Britain. But the truth is that, of course, very soon after the colony of South Australia was declared in British Parliament, that many people from the eastern states came over. Many of them escaped convicts came over, and I mean they're mentioned in the book. The Tearsmen mentioned. Yes, many of them, were likely to have been convicts. Yeah. So we don't have this sort of, if people have the posh attitude, they're completely wrong about it. But yeah, it's there weren't any sort of convict settlements per se. Yeah. It was all, initially, it was just everyone coming up and essentially seizing land, and no one necessarily doing anything about it, which is one of the reasons why George Angus was so keen to get the Germans over, because they needed people to build fences on all these cattle stations and to secure the cattle they were bringing in from Victoria. So, yeah, an interesting past, a different one, but yeah, not, we certainly had convicts around the place.
Yeah. Any other questions? I have one more. Something that we haven't touched on yet in our discussion. Taya's mother and her, was it the 7th book of Moses?
The 6th and 7th books of Moses. Yeah, this was something so, it's funny because I feel like after the Good People, I wasn't going to write anything to do with, witchcraft or folklore or any of that sort of stuff. I was like, no, that's done. And then as soon as I started researching these communities, all I encountered was stories of witches and superstitions. There was so much of it, irrespective of the fact that these were incredibly pious religious congregations. I just found so many interesting stories, about people, an old childless couple in the Barossa who was seen to milk rope ends over the back of the chair and get milk that way, and they were stealing it from their neighbours. People in Palmdorf used to wear a red ribbon around their neck when they passed the Black Witch's house, and she used to feud with the White Witch, who used to have to undo all the hexes that she would place on everyone. It was just so much, and I ended up meeting a historian who lives on the site where there's an original cottage still standing, and she was able to go and show me this nook in a chimney where they used to hide books of the occult away from the master when he used to come round. So I of course had to discover about this book of the occult that I kept on hearing mentioned. There's still apparently an altar for Black Mass in Kaiserslautern National Park in the Barossa Valley. And so I started reading about the 67th books of Moses. There's a copy in the State Library, and it is absolutely as it is described in the book. In fact, I found a copy, and I was translating all the sections in German, which are from the book, are drawn directly from the actual book. And there was a minute when I was translating it into English, when I was researching it, and it was for demon invocation. And it was like 11 o'clock at night, and I was sort of like, hope the demons know it's just for research purposes. Not really trying to get resistance here.
Just the most academic one.
Yeah, please. Yeah. But I feel like you have to include that sort of stuff when you find material pouring in. You kind of have to nod to it. So it felt like a good fit. And also the Vens were a Slavic minority who often immigrated out with these Prussian boatloads, and were sometimes suspected because a lot of these stories about witchcraft came from Vendish communities. So yeah, it was a nice way to explore difference again within the congregation through having Anna Maria as mother.
It works really well. Yeah, it's fabulous to do the book. Are there any last questions for Hannah?
No, you've asked all.
Fabulous. I would love it, and I know it's like for you over there, but just before you get to bed, would you read a passage from the book to us?
Oh, yeah, of course. Did you have one in mind, or are you happy for me to pick one?
Actually,
You pick one.
yeah, you pick one. Yeah,
Okay, all right.
You
Okay. All right, I'll read a little bit. This comes from when they've arrived in South Australia. The sound of this country is one long sustained note that does not end. It is a humming that holds all the other music of this place in harmony. Every other sound is threaded upon it. It was at the port that I began to curate new litanies. Between the bullock drivers that rumbled in from Adelaide, the sailors, the merchants, the English come in search of labourers, I found words given to the music I heard against the constant run of the wind amongst the rushes and sand dunes. She oak for the tree with long scaled needles, whistling the wind in a way that made my skin lift. Magpie lark for the two shriek cooling peep in changing hours. Salt paperbark for the crooked trees groaning wooded cupped fruit, mangrove, wattle, saltbush. In the months that came afterwards, I learned new words as the congregation did, as they crossed the dusty, ticking plains of Adelaide. I placed them next to one another upon the deeper vibration of this country. Galah, cockatoo, lorikeet, kangaroo, wallaby, possum, emu, goanna, quoll. Now, years later, sitting on the lip of this valley, I can make prayer beads of the trees that crown me, the small living things glimpsed if I am still and silent. Red gum, blue gum, quandong, stringy bark, and the birds ever here, ever singing, a liturgy to govern the hours towards gods of cry and shriek and call. Kookaburra, magpie, shrike, thrush, wagtail, caravan, crow, bulbul. Scripture may no longer roll off my tongue in smooth certainty, but my mouth is still full of spirit, holy writ of living things, each one a prayer against the teeth. Nature had always been my whetstone, had always made me keener, and after the congregation reached the foothills, I felt myself sharpened to life. The landscape on the ascent to the ranges was unlike anything I had ever seen before. I had thought the pine forest back in Kay a place of divinity, but this country was infinitely more sovereign. Each morning, while it was yet dark, the birds filled the air with singing, so that the sun, when it rose, brought light and symphony. The birds were everywhere, Hosts of raucous angels, black-bodied, yellow-topped messengers of shrieking delight, soot-streaked choral masters, feather-fat kookaburras suddenly, alarmingly proselytizing into the dawn. Even the trees grew in such a way as to welcome the sun to the world. In Prussia, canopies were dense and thick, forest floors were deeply shadowed. Here was a place of lightness. Leaves dappled thin and shiny, fluttered pink, grey, green. I crushed them in my palm and smelled medicine, healing. Hot still days dropped branches all bone crack and brought the sounds of bees. Sometimes I smelled honey warm in the air. Animals with muscled fur and liquid eyes or scaly thicknesses, tongues darting. All of it, trees and possums and kangaroos and bright beads of ants circling trunks, veered from stillness to flashing movement in an instant. There was energy here, rough softness. Sometimes it rained, and when it stopped, the air was perfume, a clean scent of wet leaf and damp sweetness. I wanted to drink that washed summer air. I imagined it tasted of reprieve.
That was beautiful, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for being our first book club guest author as well. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you tonight. Thank you everybody.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. And good luck with the book club. It's a real honour to be able to take part tonight. So thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh my goodness, see, we're just still learning how to disconnect. Thanks for your patience. You can go to well and sleep now. Thank you.
That's good.
Thank you for your well-crafted questions and the discussion. That was really very well done.
Very well. Good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you. Thanks so much for coming out. It's, we are in a kind of peak COVID experience here for Albany, and so thanks for braving it and coming and joining us tonight. That's fabulous. It's very much appreciated. And it's fabulous that people were able to watch a live stream as well.
Yeah, that's excellent.
And we just
Well done.
thank Billy for the effort and the work that she's put in for tonight. It's done an amazing job.
Yeah,
Thank you, Billy.
great.
So really, it's been amazing. It's a pleasure.
Well, thank you.
I really enjoyed it.
I think she did too.
And well done, Paige. We're so lucky to have such an amazing bookshop in town. Thank you so much.
And thank you all for coming. It's great to have you. Get your mates down next time. Let's make it easy.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
And so next month we've got